Welcome back to Mystery Minds, the channel where we dive into the darkest corners of true crime, uncovering stories that shock, intrigue, and leave us questioning the world around us. In today's case, we take you deep into the world of power, crime, and betrayal, the untold story of how a secretive brotherhood of criminals rose from the dusty streets of Sicily to rule New York City's underworld. This is the rise of the Mafia, from Sicily to New York City. A tale of blood, money, and loyalty. This story reveals how the Mafia built an empire through fear and corruption, only to watch it crumble from the inside. How did a group of Sicilian outlaws become one of the most powerful criminal organizations in history? And what led to their eventual downfall? Stay with us as we uncover the truth behind the rise and fall of the Mafia. The Mafia was born in the shadows of 19th century Sicily, where power belonged to those ruthless enough to seize it. The island had long been a place of unrest, caught between foreign rulers and a population struggling under oppression. Law and order existed only in theory, leaving the people to fend for themselves. In this chaos, a new force emerged, one that didn't rely on written laws, but on blood, loyalty, and fear. Among the first to understand this new reality was Don Vito Marchesi, a landowner who refused to let anyone dictate his business. He assembled a network of men who acted as protectors, first for his land, then for anyone willing to pay for safety. Soon, other powerful figures followed suit, and the Mafia was born. It wasn't just an organization, it was a way of life. Trust was given only to those who proved themselves, and betrayal meant death. At the heart of this growing empire was the sacred code of silence, Omertà. No one spoke of Mafia business, not to outsiders, not even to family. It was an unbreakable rule, ensuring that the law would never reach them. Those who dared to betray this code vanished without a trace, serving as a warning to others. The government, weak and easily bought, turned a blind eye. Fear did the rest. The Mafia's influence spread across Sicily, transforming from a loose collection of enforcers into an invisible government. They settled disputes with brutal efficiency, eliminating enemies with the certainty of death itself. Blood feuds, once personal, became business. Assassinations were no longer driven by revenge but by profit. Don Marchesi saw this shift early, using his power not just to enforce but to control. He manipulated trade, dictated who could buy and sell, and ensured that every coin that moved in his territory passed through his hands first. As the Mafia tightened its grip, Sicily itself suffered. Small businesses had no choice but to pay for protection, and those who refused often found their livelihoods burned to the ground. Some tried to resist, hoping to fight back against this shadowy empire. They never lasted long. The Mafia did not forgive, and it did not forget. Its power grew in the absence of law, spreading like a sickness through every level of society. But change was coming. By the late 19th century, the grip of poverty and crime had driven thousands of Sicilians to seek a new life across the ocean. Among them were criminals looking for fresh opportunities. In America, the Mafia's power was still a whisper, a ghost of what it had become in Sicily. But whispers can grow into roars. The journey across the Atlantic was a chance at freedom for many. For the Mafia, it was an expansion. What had begun as a secret society in the hills of Sicily was about to find a new home in the crowded streets of New York. The old world had given birth to the Mafia, but it would be in the new world that it would become truly unstoppable. The late 19th century saw waves of Sicilian immigrants arriving in America, desperate for a fresh start. They carried little with them: some clothes, family traditions, and the will to survive in an unfamiliar land. New York City became their new home, a place where opportunity and struggle walked hand in hand. The streets of Lower Manhattan overflowed with immigrants, crammed into tenements, taking whatever work they could find. But for some, honest labor was too slow, too uncertain. The old ways had not been left behind, they had simply found new ground. Among those stepping onto American soil was Antonio "Tony" Russo. He was young, ambitious, and saw the truth others ignored: New York's underworld was wide open. In Sicily, power came from land and control, but in America, it came from money. The Italian neighborhoods were already breeding crime, but it was disorganized, scattered between small gangs fighting for scraps. Tony had a vision of something greater, something more structured. He wasn't interested in petty theft or street fights. He wanted an empire. The timing was perfect. The city was already home to criminals of every background: Irish, Jewish, and Italian gangs fighting to control gambling, extortion, and smuggling. The Sicilians had an advantage. They had brought with them something the others lacked: discipline, secrecy, and a strict code of loyalty. While other gangs clashed openly, drawing attention from the police, the Sicilian criminals operated in the shadows, staying silent and calculated. At first, they remained small, running protection rackets within their own communities. Shopkeepers and businesses knew the deal: pay for protection, or pay a much higher price when trouble came. The police were either too indifferent or too corrupt to interfere. If a store burned down, if a man disappeared, there were no witnesses, no arrests. Fear did all the work. Then came Prohibition. In 1920, the Volstead Act made alcohol illegal, and overnight, an entire country created the perfect opportunity for men like Tony Russo. Smuggling liquor was the new gold rush, and the Mafia was ready to take its share. Russo made alliances with bootleggers, bribed police officers, and expanded his reach far beyond the Italian neighborhoods. Ships loaded with whiskey from Canada and rum from the Caribbean funneled into New York, filling hidden speakeasies across the city. The profits were staggering, and with each passing year, the Sicilian gangs became more organized, more dangerous. But New York was a battlefield, and power was never given, only taken. Rival gangs saw the Mafia's growing influence and wanted a piece. The bloodshed that followed was unlike anything the city had seen before. Bombings, drive-by shootings, bodies dumped in the East River. Violence became a daily occurrence. But while others fought recklessly, Tony Russo and his men played the long game, eliminating rivals with precision, consolidating power while letting others destroy themselves. The Mafia was no longer a loose collection of criminals. It was evolving. The street gangs of yesterday were giving way to a new kind of organization, one built on secrecy, structure, and absolute control. New York was changing, and the Mafia was changing with it. The days of small-time crime were over. The rise of a true underworld empire had begun. By the 1930s, the Mafia had become a force that no one could ignore. What had started as a scattered collection of Sicilian gangs had transformed into a highly structured organization, operating with the precision of a corporation and the brutality of an army. At the center of it all was Salvatore the Boss Moretti, a man who understood that power didn't come from chaos, it came from control. Moretti was unlike the gangsters who had come before him. He didn't rely on street fights or reckless violence. He believed in structure, in rules, in making sure the Mafia operated like a business. Under his leadership, the 5 most powerful crime families of New York: Bonanno, Colombo, Gambino, Genovese, and Lucchese formed an alliance. This was no longer a loose network of criminals. It was the Commission, a governing body that decided who lived, who died, and how business was done. The days of gang wars were over. From now on, the Mafia would move as one. With their new structure in place, the families expanded their operations. Gambling, loan sharking, extortion, these were just the beginning. They took control of labor unions, ensuring that every construction project, every shipping dock, every factory in New York operated under their terms. If a business wanted to survive, it had to pay. If a politician wanted to win, he had to listen. The Mafia didn't just control crime, it controlled the city itself. The money poured in faster than ever. Illegal casinos flourished, and bookmaking operations handled bets on everything from horse racing to boxing. Drug trafficking, once considered too risky, became another source of income. Heroin shipments moved through hidden channels, and anyone who got in the way disappeared. The Mafia had mastered the art of staying in the shadows while controlling everything in plain sight. No one could stop them. Law enforcement was either paid off or too afraid to interfere. The police took bribes to look the other way. Judges dismissed cases when key witnesses refused to testify. Fear kept everything in place, ensuring that no one dared to challenge the power of the families. Those who broke the rules, even within the Mafia itself, were dealt with swiftly. 1 minute, a man could be sitting at a table with his closest friends. The next, he could be gone, his body never found, his name erased as if he had never existed. But absolute power came with a price. The more the Mafia expanded, the more attention it attracted. The FBI had begun watching, slowly piecing together the puzzle of an organization that had always operated in the dark. Agents infiltrated, informants were turned, and the illusion of invincibility began to crack. For now, the Mafia remained untouchable. Moretti and his men controlled the most powerful criminal empire in the country. They had the money, the connections, and the fear of an entire city on their side. But beneath the surface, trouble was brewing. The same structure that had made them strong would one day become their greatest weakness. The commission that had united them would be the very thing that set their downfall in motion. By the 1960s, the Mafia had reached the peak of its power. The five families controlled everything from illegal gambling and drug trafficking to labor unions and construction contracts. Their influence stretched far beyond the streets of New York, seeping into politics, law enforcement, and legitimate businesses. No major deal happened without their approval, and no fortune was made without a percentage flowing back to them. The system had been perfected over decades, silent, efficient, and seemingly untouchable. But power breeds enemies, and the Mafia had made plenty. The FBI had spent years trying to infiltrate the organization, but the code of silence, Omertà, had kept the truth buried. Witnesses refused to talk, cases fell apart, and juries were too scared to convict. The Mafia seemed invincible. That changed in 1963 when Joseph Valakai, a low-level soldier facing a long prison sentence, made a decision that shook the underworld to its core. Valakai became the first member of the Mafia to break Omertà. He testified before a U.S. Senate committee, exposing the inner workings of the organization. For the first time, the public learned about the commission, the structure of the families, and the way power was distributed. The secrets that had kept the Mafia in the shadows for so long were now laid bare. His testimony led to arrests, but it was only the beginning. Law enforcement had finally found a crack in the armor. The 1970s saw a relentless push against organized crime. Wiretaps, undercover operations, and surveillance tightened around the families. The FBI had a new weapon, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, known as RICO. This law allowed prosecutors to charge entire crime families as criminal enterprises, making it easier to take down not just individuals, but the entire leadership structure. Despite the growing pressure, the Mafia refused to go down without a fight. Corruption had been their shield for years, and they used every resource to protect themselves. Judges were bribed, witnesses vanished, and intimidation kept many silent. Even when arrests were made, the bosses still operated from inside prison walls, giving orders through trusted messengers. But something had changed. The fear that once kept the organization united was beginning to crumble. More members started to question their loyalty. The old rule of silence no longer seemed worth a life behind bars. One by one, informants emerged, cutting deals in exchange for reduced sentences. Each betrayal was a dagger in the heart of the Mafia, unraveling its once airtight control. The downfall was slow but inevitable. One by one, the leaders of the five families were arrested, convicted, and sent away for life. The Mafia was no longer the untouchable force it had been. Law enforcement had evolved, using new technology, new strategies, and new alliances to dismantle what had once seemed unstoppable. Even as the trials ended and the convictions mounted, the question remained, was the Mafia truly dead, or had it simply adapted, finding new ways to survive in an ever-changing world? The empire had fallen, but its legacy was far from over. The fall of the Mafia's empire did not mean the end of its influence. Even as the government dismantled the organization piece by piece, the legacy of the five families remained deeply embedded in American culture. The world had watched in fascination as law enforcement took down the most powerful crime syndicate in history, but instead of fading into obscurity, the Mafia's story became larger than life. Hollywood turned real-life crime into legend. Movies like The Godfather and Goodfellas romanticized the underworld, portraying mobsters as men of honor bound by loyalty and tradition. The reality had been far more brutal, but the public couldn't look away. The Mafia's code, its power, and its dramatic rise and fall became the inspiration for countless books, films, and television shows. Fiction blurred with reality, keeping the mystique of organized crime alive long after the courtroom battles had ended. While the old guard of the Mafia was either imprisoned or dead, organized crime itself was far from extinct. The five families still existed, but they had adapted. The violence that once defined their rule had been replaced with a quieter, more discreet approach. Instead of bloody turf wars, they operated in the background, using legitimate businesses to conceal illegal activities. Drug trafficking, money laundering, and cybercrime became their new enterprises. The world had changed, and so had the Mafia. International crime syndicates also rose to power, filling the void left by the American Mafia's decline. Russian, Chinese, and Mexican cartels expanded their operations, bringing a level of brutality that even the old Sicilian bosses would have found shocking. The Mafia no longer ruled the underworld alone. It had become one player in a much larger game. Law enforcement remained vigilant, knowing that organized crime never truly disappears. RICO laws continued to be used against suspected mobsters, and surveillance technology made secrecy harder to maintain. The Mafia's influence over unions and politicians had weakened, but it had not vanished entirely. The lessons learned from the past ensured that its remaining members operated with extreme caution, avoiding the mistakes that had led to the downfall of their predecessors. Despite the shift in power, the fascination with the Mafia never faded. Stories of its past glories and betrayals continued to captivate the public. The names of infamous bosses, legendary heists, and brutal betrayals were remembered, analyzed, and retold for new generations. The Mafia was no longer the force it had once been, but its legend remained immortal. The rise and fall of the Mafia had reshaped America, leaving behind a history written in blood and ambition. While the organization itself had weakened, its impact on crime, culture, and justice would never be forgotten. The world had seen what absolute power looked like, and it had learned what it took to bring such an empire to its knees. But as long as there were those willing to break the rules, to defy the law for wealth and power, the spirit of the Mafia would never truly die. The rise and fall of the Mafia is a story of ambition, power, and betrayal, a chilling reminder that crime may pay, but never forever. If you found this story intriguing, subscribe to Mystery Minds for more true crime stories that uncover the darkest secrets of history. And let us know in the comments, which Mafia story do you want us to cover next? Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, and keep questioning the world around you.